Hello, young Star Trek fans. I have a new recording for you from Star Trek II short stories. So each short story will be marked saying its name and the number, and you can just zip straight to that one if that's what you want to do. But today, just introducing it, Star Trek II short stories by William Rotsler. And the first short story is called The Blaze of Glory. Admiral James T. Kirk stepped from the sonic shower with a feeling of fresh excitement. In a matter of 2 hours, they would drop out of warp speed and use their impulse engines to put them in orbit around Regulus III, the planet called Kepri. Then he would welcome aboard Fleet Admiral Karis Adam Taitnam, the hero of the Battle of Vanra, the destroyer of Klingons, as the media had dubbed him. Kirk looked at himself in the mirror, critically examining his still youthful body. He was no longer the trim, brash young lieutenant who had shipped into space aboard the Farragut, but thanks to constant exercise, the longevity serum, and a good diet, he was in reasonable shape. No, blast it, he grinned. Good shape. Kirk quickly donned his dress uniform and took the turbo lift to the bridge. As he entered, Lieutenant Commander Sulu rose from the captain's chair. "Captain on the bridge," announced Sulu. "I have the con," Kirk said formally. He dropped into the familiar command chair as Sulu took the navigator's place. "ETA, Mr. Sulu." 4 minutes to subject. And estimate 42 into stable orbit, sir." Kirk punched the chair arm control. "Engine room." "Aye, sir." "Scotty, everything ready?" "Aye, sir. The reception committee is suiting up now." "Bridge out." Kirk looked at Uhura. "Mr. Spock to the bridge, please." She broadcast the request over the ship, and in a few moments Commander Spock appeared, lean and almost satanic. "Admiral." "Spock, everything's all right?" "If you mean for Admiral Taitnam's arrival, yes, sir. The main guest cabin is ready. The yeoman has the Admiral's favorite beverages. We consulted the ship's computer and have programmed his favorite music." Good. Kirk looked at Spock and grinned slightly. "I don't mind telling you, Mr. Spock, it's like meeting Nelson or Drake. Taitnam is one of the greatest heroes in Federation history." "So I noted, Admiral. If I may say so, it might be comparable to me meeting Serac, the father of Vulcan logical thought, but on an entirely different level, of course." "Yes, that would be more like me meeting Plato, or Bones meeting Hippocrates. Taitnam's quite old, of course, but still a serving officer." Kirk added hastily, "I remember reading his Battle of Vanra in the Academy, and..." Just then the Enterprise dropped out of warp speed, and there lay Regulus. Sulu adjusted course, and Kepri appeared dead ahead. Somewhere closer to its sun, which the natives called Ra and the Federation doggedly called Regulus, were Horus and Osiris. Further out were cold Khonsu and frigid Ptah, and even further out were the gas giant Ramses and the ice ball called Nefertari. Kirk waited with ill-concealed impatience as the great cruiser moved gracefully into orbit. "Admiral Taitnam's party is ready to board, sir," Uhura announced. "Sulu, take the con," Kirk ordered. He and Spock left the bridge at once. In the main transporter room, Kirk glanced at the double row of young lieutenants standing at attention, then nodded to the transporter chief. "Beam them aboard." The columns of sparkling light appeared and became Fleet Admiral Taitnan and 4 of his staff. "Permission to come aboard, Admiral," Taitnan said in his powerful voice. "Permission granted," Kirk said, saluting the legend who stepped from the transporter bench. He was a tall, impressive man, white-haired, with large physical features given to broad, almost theatrical gestures. Taitnan turned to the first of his staff. "Captain Tapia, my chief of staff." Kirk and Tapia exchanged firm handshakes. "Baroness Commander Amalia, my aide-de-camp." Kirk smiled as he exchanged greetings with the beautiful young woman, on whom the Federation uniform appeared to be painted. "Commander Ogar and Lieutenant Commander Anderson," Taitnan said. "Off the stage," he commanded, gesturing. To the transporter chief, he said, "Bring the rest of our gear up at once and have it appropriately stowed." "Yes, sir," the young officer snapped, plainly impressed. "Now, Kirk, let's see this ship of yours, shall we? I've been hearing fantastic things about you. The V'ger affair, you must tell me everything. I'm dying to hear." "Thank you, Admiral. I'd be most pleased, but—" he hesitated. "Your orders, sir. I was told you would provide the destination." "Ah, of course. Baroness?" The blonde young woman pulled a small plastic block from the dispatch case which hung from her shoulder and handed it to Kirk. He looked at it, saw the imperial seal of the Emperor of Maradi on the information block. Kirk raised his eyebrows. "A secret destination, Admiral?" Kirk asked. The dark plastic block was a molecular recording device which, when inserted into a ship's navigation computer and then activated, would direct the vessel to the device's encoded location. A simple computation, once underway, would give them the main direction, but one never knew when the course would be changed or indeed what the final destination was. Admiral Taitnan put his arm around Kirk's shoulders. Don't you worry, son. You know how they use old duffers like me." He took Kirk out into the corridor and toward the turbolift, followed by Spock and the entourage. "Secret diplomacy, powers behind thrones, that sort of thing." "But I might better be able to do the job if I know where—" "In time, son, in time. Don't you worry. Just pop that cube in the nav computer and let's be on our way. Now, you just show me this ship of yours, hey? Ogar, you watch things here." As they entered the turbolift, Kirk handed the cube to Spock. "Take care of this," he said, meaningfully looking his first officer in the eye. "Yes, Admiral," Spock responded. "Anderson," Admiral Taitnan said, "you get us settled down now, you hear?" "Yes, sir," Anderson said in a calm voice. He remained with Spock as Kirk, Baroness Amalia, and Captain Tapia entered the turbolift. "Show me the engine room first, son, and save the bridge for last. I like the bridge best of all, you know." Kirk nodded, remembering reading of the devastated bridge of the King Richard, air leaking out, half the phasers out, warp engines ready to blow. But still Taitnan had sent volley after volley into the Klingon battleships, which greatly outnumbered him. Taitnan had won that battle, and many more after that, against both Klingons and Romulans. But it had been 29 years before, almost 7 decades after the end of the Romulan War, when there had been an attempt by that savage race to break the treaty. Kirk wondered what the great admiral had been doing since then. When he had received his orders, he was faintly surprised that the old man was even still alive. Kirk glanced at Baroness Amalia. She's a cool one, he thought, but I must not misunderstand or misinterpret her relationship to Taitnan. They toured the engine room, and Taitnan spoke with generosity to a beaming Montgomery Scott. They passed through the rec room, where the crew there broke into spontaneous applause. something I had never seen happen before. I also noted that Taitnan did not seem surprised. I wonder what it must be like, Kirk thought, to be immediately recognized wherever you go, to have people applaud and admire. Some kings don't get that, he thought. Perhaps only the most famous and beloved of entertainers. Then they came upon the bridge. The people there were too disciplined to applaud, but they cast admiring glances at this most famous of star sailors. Kirk offered the command chair to Taitnan, but he refused. "Thank you, no, son. If I took it, I might just not give it back," he laughed. "Well, you certainly have a fine ship here, Admiral. A fine ship. I see the updating and retrofitting has done wonders. Excellent, excellent." He turned to Baroness Amalia. "Come, Commander. Let's get to work on—" He paused and gave Kirk a wide smile and a wink. "You know, Admiral, I have to watch what I say. That's what I have Amalia here for, and she watches out for an old man's slips of the tongue." She merely smiled, a soft and, Kirk thought, a knowing smile. Captain Tapia, who had been silent all through the inspection, spoke up. "Your Commander Spock, where is he?" The turbolift hissed open and Spock entered. He nodded to Admiral Taitnan and strode over to hand the cube to Sulu. "Mr. Sulu, this is your prepared course." Sulu took the cube, saw the royal seal, and glanced up at the impassive Spock. He peeled off the seal, the cube turned red, and he pressed it into the proper slot on his console. "Ready, sir." "The gear all aboard, Spock?" Admiral Taitnan asked. "Yes, Admiral." "Let her rip, son," Admiral Taitnan said. Sulu hesitated, glancing around at Kirk, who nodded. Sulu's expert fingers touched the studs and buttons, and the great ship came to life. The feel of the ship on impulse engines was totally different from the way it seemed on warp drive. The Enterprise broke orbit and headed away. "Warp 1, Admiral Taitnan said. "As soon as we hit that, it'll all be automatic." "Warp 1, Mr. Sulu," Kirk said. The stars blurred and ran past as Admiral Taitnan looked at the big forward screen with a pleased expression. "I love this moment," he said. "Admiral," the Baroness said softly after a few moments. "What? Oh, all right." He smiled at Kirk. "Don't ever get old, Admiral. They hound you to death. Better I should have signed off on the bridge of the King Richard." He slapped his stomach. "Wonder of modern science, Kirk. Practically nothing is what I was born with." He laughed and put his arm around the slim, beautiful Baroness. "Very well, Amalia, let's go rummage around in the pills." As he went into the turbolift, Taitnan called out to Kirk, "Given the opportunity, Admiral, go down with your ship. In the long run, it's the best." The doors hissed closed, and there was silence on the bridge except for the mutter of navigation reports, the beep and pop of signals, and the deep thrum of the great matter antimatter engines. "Mr. Spock, I'd like to see you in my quarters in 10 minutes, Kirk said. "Mr. Sulu, you have the con." "Aye, sir." Sulu turned to watch Admiral Kirk leave the bridge, and then he turned back to exchange another look with Commander Spock. "I shall be in the captain's quarters," Spock said. "All right, Mr. Spock, what was in that cube?" "A devious course, Admiral, to Pollux 4. "Pollux 4? exclaimed Kirk. "That's disputed territory." "Exactly, sir. Not inconsistent with Admiral Taitnan's stated mission of diplomacy." "But—" "I heard a tune of but there, Spock. May I remind the captain that Fleet Admiral Taitnan is traveling under Starfleet Command orders, and what you did was a violation of regulations, I know. I'll take the responsibility." "Admiral Kirk, you did not give me orders to scan the nav cube." "Yes, I did, Mr. Spock." He smiled at the tall Vulcan. "How long have we served together, Spock? Are you going to tell me you haven't been paying attention to my subtleties?" He shook his head in mock sadness, then sobered. This is my ship, Spock. I want to know where we are going. Dangerously close to Klingon territory, sir. We won't be in violation, however. Kirk shrugged. Well, let's sit back and enjoy the trip. Spock nodded absently. Dinner that evening was quite formal. It was, in fact, one of the most lavish and formal dinners Kirk had ever given. Usually he ate what the men ate, sometimes in his quarters, sometimes with his officers, and on rare occasions, and only at their invitation, with the general crew. Kirk sat at the head of the long table, with Fleet Admiral Taitanen on his right, Baroness Commander Amalia on his left. Tapia, Ogar, and Anderson were mixed with the Enterprise senior staff. Spock, Uhura, Scott, Sulu, McCoy, Chekhov, Leslie, and several others. There was fresh Capri coquito birds, a gift from Taitanen, Altair Zanahoria, Centauri Cavolfiore, Terran potatoes, Axanar kukuridza, and Andoria wine analog. The conversation was brisk and gay, with Taitanen making an attempt to charm Uhura and succeeding. Kirk noted that the old man's bold charm did not seem to bother Amalia at all, who seemed to ignore it. Baroness Amalia kept up a conversation with the taciturn Spock, who ate slowly from his vegetarian dish. She spoke of a visit to Vulcan in her early youth with her mother, an ambassador from the Mirati Empire. She too was quite taken with the charm of the Vulcans. Kirk almost choked on his glass of wine. He had never thought of Vulcans as charming, although they might be many other things. He looked at the Baroness, but thought she seemed quite sincere. Thinking back, Kirk realized that quite a number of other women had found the austere Spock attractive and a challenge. The smoldering interests of Nurse Chapel, now Dr. Chapel, had been almost embarrassingly obvious. But it was Fleet Admiral Taitanen who dominated the table. With his darkly tanned skin, hawk nose, mane of white hair, and crisp uniform emblazoned with medals, ribbons, and the great star of Arcturus, he was a most impressive figure. I've told that story 100 times, he grumbled, responding to Uhura's question about the Battle of Vanra. Let me tell you about Paketh. That's right near my home sun of Ra, only 3-4 light years off. Taitanen launched into an account of a skirmish with Klingon scout ships, which was the precursor of the more famous Vanra battle. Kirk listened, unable to keep from being fascinated. Taitanen told the story with all the flair of a born storyteller, knowing where the thrills and laughs were, disparaging of his own valor, praising others. It was obvious he had told this story too many times, but no one minded. To Kirk it was like Nelson telling of the Battle of Trafalgar, or Eisenhower of the Normandy invasion, or Armstrong of the landing on Earth's moon. Yet something tugged at Kirk's thoughts. Taitanen seemed to relish in his wholesale destruction of Klingon ships, and in the modestly told accounts of his receptions of Federation headquarters, his great speech at Starfleet Academy, his appearance before the Grand Council. Kirk did not begrudge him the fruits of his victories, nor did he expect doers of great deeds to be unduly modest. It was the relish which disturbed him. After dinner, a few were invited to Kirk's quarters, where he talked Federation Klingon tactics with Taitanen. You've got to hit them at every opportunity, son. Be aggressive, be bold, attack. But first, surely you try to avoid war, Kirk said. But Taitanen was not listening. The only thing Klingons and Romulans understand is raw power, strength, firepower. They are barbarians at the gates of civilization, Kirk. You must hit and hit first. After all other means of diplomacy are exhausted, of course, Spock said. Taitanen eyed the Vulcan officer with hostile eyes. No offense, son, because I know you Vulcans are related distantly to the Romulans, and you're not a warlike people, but they are. They don't understand about diplomacy. They think that's weakness. You walk down some Liberty port, Telemachus, Marsport, Old Drawning, Coxey, any of the Blue Planet ports, Abramsville, any of those. You walk around those streets, you're going to get jumped, or conned, or sold into slavery maybe, if you're put out near Bryn or Prantares. But you walk those streets like you'll eat the first one that lays a finger, claw, or tentacle on you, and by the stars they'll leave you alone. Taitman sat back as if he had said everything there was to say on the subject. Kirk tactfully introduced another subject, and the old admiral launched forth on another attack. After a time, Kirk saw Spock quietly and thoughtfully leave. James Kirk sat in the command chair, watching the stars move, a sight he had never grown tired of. They were so beautiful, he thought, even in the blurred images during warp drive, so colorful, so bright, endlessly appealing. Course change, Sulu reported as the stars moved to the left. Kirk nodded. Spock's secret scan had given him the exact course plotted. Pollux 4 was not too many hours away. What then, he wondered. Well, you deliver him and you go on about your business. That's what you do. Captain, there's a ship at extreme sensor range, Lieutenant Nakashima reported. Magnify, Kirk ordered. The stars on the forward screen were replaced by a small cluster of dots. Ships, he said. 3 of them. Uhura, ask for identification. He punched his arm control. Mr. Spock, report to the bridge. They refuse to acknowledge, sir, Uhura said. Yellow alert, Kirk ordered, and the klaxon sounded. Throughout the ship, a yellow band appeared across every screen, and feet hit the deck running. The defensive screens went on. Spock entered the bridge and strode to his station. Moments later, Admiral Taitman also arrived, along with Captain Tapia and the Baroness. Klingons, the Admiral said, looking at the spectral readout screen. Correct, Spock said. 3 Klingon vessels of the Klar class. Uhura, put me through to them. Sir, you're on the hailing frequency. This is Admiral James T. Kirk of the USS Enterprise. You're in Federation territory. Identify yourselves. There was no answer. Kirk repeated the demand. Nothing. Are you in difficulty? Kirk asked. And Admiral Taitman snorted. It's a Klingon trick, he said. Kirk didn't even look at him. I must exhaust every option, he said. You're losing the advantage, Taitman said harshly. They're closing, Kirk. Open fire. They're violating Federation space. Kirk's head turned and he stared at the fleet admiral. Sir, with respect, this is my ship. Well, you won't have a ship if they can get in close enough to concentrate phaser fire from 3 ships on any one of your screens, Captain Kirk. Kirk snapped his head back toward the forward screen. Mr. Spock, your assessment? They're in violation of Federation territory, it is true, but hardly enough to start a war over. You give them a parsec and they'll take a light year, son. I know those Klingons. This is a chance to show them who's boss. Kirk looked at the famed officer in surprise. We are not attempting to decide who's boss, Admiral Taitman, only to avoid an incident. Avoid an incident, mimicked Taitman acidly. Sulu and Chekhov looked around in surprise. Regardless of what they thought of one another, high-ranking officers rarely showed animosity in public. Kirk looked stonily impassive. Turn and run, you mean? Taitman hissed. Kirk said to no one in particular, Clear the bridge of non-essential personnel. Baroness Amalia gasped, and Captain Tapia's hand touched his phaser involuntarily. But Taitman turned and wordlessly left, followed by his entourage. Try again, Kirk told Uhura. A moment later, a smile of relief came over her face. Captain Kirk, there are Klingon ambassadorial vessels escorting someone called Kara to Pollux 4. Kirk looked at Spock. He must have known. Spock shrugged. That's the reason for the trip. Kirk looked slightly sick. They are flying under Federation protection, Uhura repeated the message. Kirk looked at Sulu, who was still poised, his hand ready over the manual override, which would have disconnected the ship from the pre-recorded control cube and allowed them free movement. Relax, Mr. Sulu, and take the con. Proceed on course, Mr. Chekhov. Spock? The two men left the control room and went quickly to Kirk's quarters. Kirk turned and spoke. What in blazes was he up to? He could have started a war. Exactly, Captain. Kirk stopped his pacing and looked thoughtfully at his first officer. His days of glory. There are aspects of human psychology which completely elude me, Captain, but I think that would be a logical premise. He desires to provoke some kind of conflict and die in a blaze of glory. And not die an old man on a pension, Kirk finished. Well, we avoided that one. Jim, let me remind you, he carries enormous prestige. If we leave after putting him on Pollux 4, there will be no one to monitor his actions. Kirk groaned. The Baroness and the rest of Admiral Tatenan's personal staff stepped up upon the transporter stage, but the white-haired officer hung back a moment and spoke confidentially to Captain Kirk. Son, let me give you some advice. No, you listen. He thrust a thumb over his shoulder, presumably at the 3 Klingon ships also in parking orbit. You keep an eye on those fellas, boy, a sharp eye. The moment you see something out of line, you blast 'em. He held up a hand. I know, you young officers. Well, you don't think that way, but I've been fighting Klingons nigh as long as you've been alive, boy, and bless Ra, I'll go out fighting them. So you listen up. They're tricky as a yellow scrawl and twice as mean. He slapped Kirk on the shoulder. You'll see, he said, and gave everyone a big wave as he stepped up on the stage. Do it to us, boy, he ordered. Kirk nodded at the transporter chief, who pulled down the cycle switch. The party dissolved in beams of sparkling light and then were gone. Kirk stared at the empty stage thoughtfully, then left the room. The turbolift door hissed open and Kirk strode onto the bridge. Admiral on the bridge, Uhura said, getting up from the command chair. I have the con, Commander, Kirk said. Report. We monitored the entertainment frequencies as well as the government ones, Captain Kirk, Uhura said. All night there were parties and receptions for both the Klingons and Admiral Tatenan. They're not trying to keep it a secret any longer. This afternoon they are supposed to get together to discuss an agenda which has not yet been revealed. She smiled. But they're calling it the final act in the long human Klingon fighting, a new page in history, that sort of thing. Kirk muttered, sitting down. Keep monitoring, Uhura. The rest of the morning was taken up with administrative duties. Kirk held captain's mast, the court for minor violations, taking over the rec room to accommodate the witnesses. An electrician first was accused of stealing special food from a yeoman with Rigelian bone stress and found guilty. Failure to respond quickly enough to alerts got two specialists first extra duty. A sexual harassment charge against a female nutritionist was dismissed for lack of evidence. That's odd. A petty officer was accused by Lieutenant Deckert of reprogramming one of the computer games to win money from the crew and found guilty. Kirk was in his quarters reviewing a tape of Tactics in Space War by General Sandra Cohen when Uhura called him. Admiral, come to the bridge, please. In moments, Kirk was coming through the doors. Report, he said. Sir, the Klingons have beamed up from the conference. Reporters say they were very angry. Admiral Tatenan has issued a statement that the Klingons were not negotiating in good faith, that it was all a trap, and... Where is he now? Kirk demanded. He thumbed the general annunciator. Commander Spock to the bridge. Chekhov spoke up. Sir, someone is beaming aboard. Kirk's finger hit a button. Transporter room. This is Captain Kirk. What's going on there? Sir, Admiral Tayton and his party have just... Captain Kirk, this is Fleet Admiral Karis Adam Tayton. I'm executing Starfleet Order 1202B as of this date and moment. Please log that. Kirk blanked. That was rarely the used regulation which permitted senior officers to commandeer private, commercial, and military spacecraft in emergency situations. Tayton was taking over the Enterprise. Spock entered the bridge, eyebrows elevated. Involuntarily, Kirk's thumb stabbed at a button. Transporter room, report, answer me. Kirk, this is Tayton, blast you, I am ordering you. Kirk here, he said, his finger punching another button. Security forces to the transporter room. There's a malfunction of some kind. Contain and report. Kirk out. He looked at Spock. A fascinating situation, Captain, the Vulcan said. He did something down there, I know it, Kirk said. He deliberately blew the conference. I don't know how, but he did. He gave you a legitimate order, Spock reminded his captain. Kirk's face assumed an expression of mild surprise. He did? I didn't hear anything. There's something funny going on down there, Spock. Unauthorized personnel beaming aboard, malfunctioning communications, people hearing things. In other words, Captain, if you can delay the Admiral long enough, the Klingons will have left. Kirk shrugged. Why make a bad situation worse? He may have ruined the conference, but at least he won't start a war. Mr. Chekhov, what is the status of the 3 Klingon vessels? Shields up but quiet, sir. He looked around at his captain. Perhaps they are waiting to see what we do, Captain. Kirk nodded. And we'll do nothing. He saw a movement of Sulu's hand. No, Mr. Sulu, shields down. Sulu looked around in surprise. But, sir, we'll have no protection. I know, Mr. Sulu. Uhura, put me through to the Klingon commander. She nodded and her slim fingers played across the keys. Klingon commander ready, sir. I'm Admiral James T. Kirk of the USS... Kirk! The face on the screen was that of Kang, a Klingon captain whom Kirk had met years before. Kirk! Klingon's voice was almost friendly. We meet again. Kang, Kirk said, just as surprised. I thought they'd discipline you after Beta 12 Alpha. They did, Kirk, they did. In their way, I'm still a captain, and you're an admiral. The Klingon in his dark uniform with the glittering sash shrugged. Is Mara well? Kirk asked. My wife is well. She retired to care for our daughters. Congratulations, Kang. For what, Kirk? They're females. He all but roared the last word. And now your ambassador has put impossible demands upon us? Kang appeared monumentally angry. My father fought against him at Vanra. He was a brilliant tactician then, but now he's a fool. The Klingon Empire cannot possibly consider even one of his preposterous proposals. You won't have to, Kang. He threatened us, Kirk. Threatened us with you in the Enterprise. Well, we are 3-1, Kirk. We shall see who journeys to the end of time as a gas human. Wait, Kang, there's no need for this. He insulted us. He belittled us. Granted, he's no diplomat. Kang stared at Kirk through the screen and the universal translator. No diplomat, he said slowly, then burst into a torrent of laughter. No diplomat. After a moment, he sobered and spoke with a calmer manner. I have a desire to start a war, Kirk. I have no desire to start a war, Kirk. I attack you, you attack me. One wins, one loses, but there will be many deaths. There's no honor in that. Sounds to me as if you'd mellowed, Kang. Kirk saw a flash on Kang's former anger, and then the big, dark Klingon shrugged. Maybe, even with daughters, you think about what is to come. Then his eyes bored into Kirk's. But if we meet where there is reason to fight, just you and I, ship against ship. Kirk laughed. There's the old irascible Kang we all know and love. Kang glowered some more. Look, we'll leave together, all right? Then Neither's retreating from the other. Done. Kang turned at once, his deep voice giving orders. Kirk spoke too. Mr. Sulu, warp us out of orbit. Set a course for Regulus 3, warp 5 the moment it is safe. Aye, sir. Kang turned back, something like a smile on his face. Kirk, you had best mothball that old admiral. He was first in his day, but... He shrugged, and Kirk nodded. Captain, Uhura said, Admiral Taitnan has broken out of the transporter room and is going aboard the shuttlecraft Galileo. Kang, don't do anything. I see it, the Klingon snarled, staring at an off-camera screen. And I know what he intends to do. He looked back at Kirk. Admiral, I think we're about to do the Federation Starfleet a great service. No! But Kang was gone, and Kirk fell back into his chair. Get a tractor beam on them, he ordered. Get them back aboard. Negative, Captain, Spock said. He is approaching the Klingons along one of only 2 routes where we cannot reach him, where the nacelles interfere. Kirk watched helplessly as the Galileo headed straight toward the Klingon vessel at top speed. The Klingon Klar-class ship had its defensive screens up, but they were only effective against radiation, electronic emissions such as phasers, or fast-moving physical objects such as bullets. Swift but still slow-moving shuttlecraft could go right through, and Taitnan intended to ram. Go to warp speed, muttered Kirk angrily. They're too close to each other, Captain, Spock said. The emissions will pull each other apart. Then why don't they... A phaser spat a single burst, and shuttlecraft exploded. The bits and pieces which were not vaporized went straight out in a spherical pattern. Eventually they would reach the edge of the galaxy and just keep going. Uhura, send this message to Starfleet. Fleet Admiral Karis Adem Taitnan, hero of the Battle of Honra, destroyer of Klingons, died today on the bridge of a spacecraft after an unfortunate accident. Captain Kang, commander of the Klingon craft, which accidentally struck Admiral Taitnan's shuttlecraft, expressed deep regret. James T. Kirk, Admiral, USS Enterprise. Story 2. Under Twin Moons. Liberty Port, Lex Nakashima grinned. The young officer smiled at Lieutenant Commander Uhura and Dr. McCoy sitting in the rec room. Around them, off-duty crew members were drinking, snacking, talking, playing cards, and challenging each other to the various complex computer games. McCoy smiled at the young lieutenant, then looked at Uhura. I remember some of my early planet falls on the Crockett and the Xerxes, he said, and what I thought a good Liberty port was. But it's Macedon 3, Nakashima said eagerly, unable to keep the grin off his face. And you've heard all about the plume dancers, Uhura smiled, and the new Temple of Zeus, the Thieves' Market, and Queen Daria. Nakashima nodded. The Warrior King, the Pool of Circe, and... Hold it, McCoy laughed, holding up his hand. Are you being paid by the Macedon Chamber of Commerce? Well, gee, Doctor, this is really the Liberty port in this sector. But not a member of the Federation, Uhura reminded him. The Empire of Thrace is independent of both the Federation and the Klingon-Romulan alliance, so don't bring disgrace down on us. McCoy looked at her in mock surprise. A sailor on leave bringing trouble? They laughed, but Uhura tilted her head at the young officer. Remember, Mr. Nakashima, deportment, but have a good time. I think you've just given him a problem he can't solve, McCoy said. Nakashima walked quickly on, waving farewell. Good man, McCoy said, looking after him. He turned to Uhura. You going ashore? Uhura responded slowly. No, I don't think so, Doctor. McCoy's manner changed to one of quiet concern. You should. You didn't go down at Upsilon 9, nor Lieberman's world. You're going to get cabin fever. I'm all right, Doctor, really. Young woman, I am the chief medical officer of this ship, and I'm ordering you to get some R&R. The beautiful young black woman started to speak, but McCoy held up a hand. That's an order, Commander Uhura. Where matters of health, both physical and psychological, are concerned, I am boss. Uhura sighed and smiled. Oh, very well. The proper response to an order from a superior officer in Starfleet is, yes, sir. McCoy grinned. Yes, sir. And I don't mean to just go planet-side and look at the museums. I mean have some fun. Yes, sir, Uhura said, giving him a mock salute. Fun, sir, yes, sir. The shuttlecraft Columbus dropped through the atmosphere and arced toward a landing at New Athens. The ship was crowded with happy, chattering officers and men. It was more efficient to take shiploads down in the two shuttlecraft than to beam them down in smaller numbers, but it took longer. Uhura didn't mind. She looked out at the Class 3 world curiously. It had been a long time since she set foot on the soil of any planet, or looked up at anything but a ceiling, or saw further than the length of the rec room. Maybe McCoy was right, she thought. Get out and see something of the galaxy. Stop hiding away in the Enterprise. The heavy cruiser was a big ship with a great variety of services and entertainments to interest and amuse the crew. But there were no real surprises. However, a new planet always had surprises. That was an axiom of space travel. Macedon had been populated early in the days of human space exploration by an ethnic group from Earth arriving via sleeper ships. They had mixed easily with the native humanoids, remnants of a war-devastated race called the Thracians. All this had occurred well before the strong enforcement of the Federation's prime directive, that rule of non-interference with the normal development of alien life and societies. Despite her initial disinclination, Uhura felt the fast pulse of excitement creep over her. There was nothing to fear, she thought. Thrace and the Federation were on excellent terms, even if Thrace was also on good terms with the Klingons. Nothing to fear, that is, except what one might fear in any Liberty port, from San Francisco to Marsport or Telemachus on Teller. Thieves, conmen, drunks, dippers, people with a hatred for the Federation, these were the standard dangers. No, she thought, I have nothing unusual to fear. Then why am I getting nervous, she thought. New Athens was not a large city. The Thracians had believed in small cities, 25,000 to 50,000 at most, where it was possible that everyone might know everyone else, or at least know them by sight or reputation. The buildings were not large, and despite the names transplanted from Terra, they were not in the classical Greek architectural style, but did have a certain faint functional resemblance. The weather was usually warm, so therefore they built structures with deep columned porches to capture and cool the wind, and the building material was mostly smoothly shaped stone. But the ornamentation was totally abstract, somewhat like the geometrical designs of Arabia. Even the statues were non-representational, based more on the auras of each people sculpted than upon their physical appearance. Flowering trees called the ormacae were everywhere, with dark green leaves and scores of red, yellow, and orange flowers. As a result, there were many insects, but they had a kind of radar which kept them from hitting or landing on any living thing. It took Uhura some time to stop ducking and waving at the fat bugs, but when none touched her, she soon adjusted. Once the double suns had gone below the horizon, the evenings were nearly totally free of any insects. Uhura stood on the wide terrace of Hotel Terra, where Federation personnel usually stayed. The hotel was on a hill, and she could see the other hills of New Athens, and on the highest hill, the new Temple of Zeus. The palace of the warrior king was further away, a stark fortress of black stone, topped by crimson-capped towers. A bird, glutted with his daily gorging of insects, flopped lazily by. There was music from the ballroom and the scent of the night-blooming moonflowers. And, of course, the two moons, Circe and Artemis, casting pale double shadows across the terrace. Uhura sighed. It was good to put her feet on something besides a deck, to breathe scents instead of filtered, tasteless air. I missed it, she thought. I miss him too, she sighed. It had been a long time, a very long time. Jomo Marumbi, Captain, Special Forces, United States of Africa, killed in the performance of his duties, 16th October 2164, Abia, Somalia. Rest in peace. Uhura looked at the moons. All right, she told herself. Get yourself out of it. It's been long enough, girl. You were not a widow, yet you've acted like one most of the time. Get on with your life. Good evening. Uhura turned at the sound of a deep voice and saw a handsome man smiling at her. Surprised she could only say, good evening. But her thoughts were different. Great stars, he's attractive. This was followed in a microsecond by her next thought. A man this attractive is either married or a rat. I hope you don't mind, he said. I couldn't help speaking to you. I saw you inside and... He hesitated, then smiled. I am violating some sort of protocol, I'm sure, but I had to speak to you. That's all right, she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. She turned to the terrace railing and looked out at the moonlit city. I was just admiring the view. It is nice, isn't it? He said, stepping to her side. Careful, girl, she told herself. Your breathing is giving you away. That's the palace, right? And the Temple of Zeus. The new Temple of Zeus, he corrected. That, he pointed, is the Museum of Terran History. Next to it, the Museum of the History of Thrace. See that dome? That's the tomb of Alexander, the first king of the Empire of Thrace. Uhura smiled. Sounds very Grecian. The man smiled. He was just a touch presumptive, I think. He was born Murray Fox in some suburb of greater New York. Like many powerful leaders, Hitler, Stalin, the popes, Caligula, Zog, Philistra, he changed his name to something more suitable. Like an actor, he agreed, recasting himself in the mold he found himself in. And you, what do they call you? Uhura, Nyota Uhura. She raised her eyebrows, and he responded, Gerald. He took her hand and kissed it, bowing slightly. How may I be of service to a commander of the Federation forces? She tilted her head. By telling me what brings you here, to the tourist trap? He smiled. He was dark-skinned, dark-eyed. His hand, still holding hers, was strong and warm. Duty, Commander. I escorted the matriarch to meet your Captain Kirk. He looked back across the terrace where, through the high, narrow windows, they could see the dancers and the clot of uniforms around someone unseen. But why aren't you at her side? Uhura smiled. I saw you. He waved across the ballroom. Besides, my aunt is quite capable of caring for herself. I am only window dressing. Uhura let her gaze wander over his tall, broad-shouldered figure, taking in the ornate breastplate with the stylized Gorgon head, the epaulets with insignia she did not recognize, and the wrist communicator of the latest Terran design. It must be a pretty fancy window, she murmured, then regretted her comment. He shrugged. I'm afraid I'm so used to dressing a certain way I forgot what it is like to have options. Uhura nodded. Me too. I've worn a uniform so long I think I'd be confused if I had to decide. They're already talking about a new uniform for Starfleet. You've been in the service long? All my life, he said, moving distressingly close. I was born a hereditary colonel. I wore a little colonel's suit when I was 5, he laughed. I kept stumbling over the sword. Hereditary colonel, Uhura said. Might there be some indication of rank to go with that? She asked, indicating his breastplate and insignia. He looked at her a moment. I hesitate because, well, too often it comes between people. Uhura smiled. What are you, Jarl? Head of the secret police? Head of the Assassin's Guild? She found herself wanting to know. This was the first man who had stirred her at all in a very long time. He bowed again. Commander Uhura, allow me to present myself. Jarl Perseus Anacreon Justile Demetrius Stephanopoulos, hereditary colonel of the companions of Alexander, Count of Samos, Baron of Bactria, Prince Jarl of Sparta, Order of the Shield of Medusa, Star of Apollo, Protector of Delphi, and sworn warrior of the Empire of Thrace. Uhura just stared at him. You may call me Jarl, he smiled. He peered at her. See? What did I say? An accident of birth and it keeps everyone away. Look at me, the poor prince, alone in my black stone castle at Samos, with no one to play with, desperate for friendship, rejected by... Uhura's sudden laughter caused him to stop. They smiled at each other. I'm just here on leave, she said softly. A touch of fear crept into her mind. He was like Jomo, yet not. This one was far more sophisticated, and therefore in her mind more dangerous. Then we must take advantage of every moment, he said. He looked toward the ballroom. Come on. I've got to get the old vulture and escort home. But... He grabbed her hand and they hurried across the smooth stone terrace into the hustle and bustle of a fancy dress ball. There were Thracian men and women, tall, graceful, and pale, in toga-like garments of many soft hues. There were the descendants of the Terran settlers in uniforms, formal civilian wear and togas. Uhura spotted Captain Kirk in his full fancy uniform as an admiral in the Starfleet of the United Federation of Planets, with every medal on display and a wide smile on his face. There were others around. Mr. Spock in full uniform, spotless and perfect, a slightly rumpled Commander Scott, McCoy with the Thracian beauty on either side, Sulu, Chekhov, and Leslie, the A&A officer. But it was the women to whom Kirk was talking that seized her attention. This old vulture was a beautiful woman in her early 50s, pale skin unlined, dressed in a simple dark gown with fire rubies and opals, and a headdress of gold filigree, pin pearls, and delicate oryx shells. She laughed at something Kirk had said, then saw Jarl. Her smiling eyes went to Uhura, and in that moment Uhura knew she had been analyzed, filed, and classified. Jarl, she said, who is this lovely creature? Matriarch, this is Lieutenant Commander Nyota Uhura of the USS Enterprise. Commander, this is Myrni of Sparta, Priestess of Artemis, Duchess of Korai, Keeper of the Sacred Flame, Matriarch of New Athens, and my aunt. Uhura unaccountably found a smile tugging at her lips. She bowed very slightly. As a free citizen of the United States of Africa, and as a member of the Federation, she thought herself equal to anyone in a certain sense. She would bow and bow deeply to any Japanese, for that was a cultural thing, like shaking hands. But to bow in deference was something else again. A very slight narrowing of the eyes betrayed the matriarch's acknowledgement of Uhura's unspoken comment. Are you enjoying yourself, Commander? The old woman said, smiling. It is a lovely city, Uhura said, well aware that everyone was listening. Well, she thought, you can't have a conversation with someone like the matriarch and not have everyone listen in. Tomorrow I am showing the commander the Pool of Circe, the Fireflower Islands, and perhaps the Sea of Argos, Jarl added. Uhura looked at him curiously. He had lied with such a calm certainty that he must be practiced, she thought. Be careful of my nephew, Commander, the matriarch said. He is the premier breaker of hearts on this continent. Why, matriarch, you do me an injustice, Jarl said. You forget I visit Apollonia and Byzantium every year. Before she could say anything, Jarl turned to Kirk. Admiral, with your permission, I should like to show the wonders of New Athens to your lovely commander this night. Kirk looked at Uhura and raised his eyebrows. Her eyes dropped. Very well, Prince Jarl, but remember, my officers must be back aboard within 46 hours. Uhura shot her captain a dark look, but she had trapped herself by not protesting when Jarl had announced their travel plans. But Captain Kirk, she thought, should not presume so much. Admiral, Jarl said, I wonder if you might escort the matriarch home. Kirk bowed a pleased consent. With your permission, Auntie, Jarl said with a smile. She sniffed at the Auntie but waved him away and turned with a bright smile to Spock. I am fascinated by Vulcans, she said. They seem so much different than us. That is because we are, milady, Spock said. Jarl pulled Uhura through the throng of people surrounding the matriarch and Kirk, but at the edge of the crowd, Uhura stopped. "Don't you think you could have asked me?" she demanded. He turned a charming smile on her. "But you do want to see all those things, don't you? Everyone does, even we of Thrace." "Yes, but—" "Then let us set forth for the first of them, the ruins of Corin by moonlight." He took her elbow and guided her along to an exit. "Some say it is the greatest romantic sight in the galaxy, but I'm certain they must be Thracians who said that." Despite herself, Uhura was intrigued. This handsome, perhaps overly confident man was determined to sweep her off her feet. It was an exhilarating feeling. "Corin," she said, "isn't that the ruin of the great temple from before Terrans came?" "Yes," he said, returning the salute of the guards at the hotel exit. A lifted hand brought them a carriage drawn by 4 deer-like creatures with bells on their harnesses. "To Corin," he ordered the driver, an elderly Thracian. They went down the hotel hill and across a park, up narrow streets between old buildings, then into another populated valley. But as they started up another hill, the houses gave way to tombs, and then ruins of old structures in a very different style of architecture. The columns were shorter and thicker, bulging in the center, with ornate capitals. The windows in the ruined walls were round, the buildings smaller. "Corin was the palace of the Farkash dynasty," Jarl said. "They were long gone, and the Thracians had just been thrust back to hunters and hunter-gatherers by the time my ancestors came. War, plague, ego," he shrugged. "An old story. The other race, the Thracians, were wiped out. We rebuilt, incorporating the remaining Thracians into government and society." "Instead of a slave race, as some might have," Uhura said. Jarl nodded. The carriage came to the top of the hill. They could see the lights of New Athens, but it was the ruins which attracted the attention of the Federation officer. They were immense. Crumbling, carved walls, thick and forbidding, scenes of war and triumph were still to be seen, muted by time and weather. Ancient humanoid kings on lavish thrones, surrounded by proud generals, with captured princes at their feet. And naked slaves bearing treasure were a repeated theme. They got out and strolled amid the falling stones. Here was a nicked chopping block of granite used by executioners. There the feet and legs of a broken statue to a forgotten warrior king. The roofs had all fallen in, but the notches and openings for the great beams of carry wood could still be seen, usually filled with bird nests. A turning of a wall had sheltered a mural of glazed brick, and in the twin moonlight, Uhura could make out a scene of harvest, with slaves and a harvest goddess looming over a sacrificial victim. She shivered. They were bloodthirsty. "No more than our own ancestors," Jarl said. He gestured around him. "This is a reminder of what happens to civilizations who build on cruelty and slavery, who live by aggression and war." They walked on paths of crushed stone bordered by weeds. Here and there gleamed a night flower like a stationary firefly, sending out its tiny beacon to the only insect who flew the night, the dark beetle. There was a rustle behind them and footsteps. Surprised, Jarl turned, his hand going toward his sword, but the dark figures were upon them, truncheons raised. Uhura cried out in surprise, then grabbed the wrist of one attacker and flipped him into a pile of stones. A club struck at her, hitting her left shoulder and numbing it to the elbow. Jarl grunted as 2 of them struck at him. He staggered, slashing out with his sword, making one of the attackers scream and bend over. Jarl raised his weapon for another strike, but somehow threw a club and hit him across the throat. He choked and fell, and the sword was knocked from his hand. Uhura kicked out and felled one attacker, but there were too many of them. Something made a great white light in her head, and she was blinded, falling forward into darkness. A kick in her side aroused her. She groaned and made herself open her eyes. Her head throbbed viciously, and her side, thigh, and shoulder were stiff and badly bruised. She was in some kind of stone room. Her uniform jacket had been removed, and her wrists were tied. She shifted her sore body to look up at whoever had kicked her and saw a dark, raggedy man looming over her. "Who the blazes are you?" she demanded. "I'm a Federation officer, and—" She cried out as he kicked her viciously in the side. She rolled away from him, wincing at the fragments of stone which struck into her. Then she saw Prince Gerald. He was unconscious, his head still oozing blood. His hands were tied, and his breastplate and most of the uniform had been taken away, leaving him in tight trousers and a thin collarless shirt. Their captor pointed to a wooden bucket of water and some pads of bandages, which looked none too clean. "Take care of him," he grunted. "Who are you?" Uhura demanded, getting to her knees painfully. "Why did you—" She broke off to avoid another kick. "Fix him," the man said and left, slamming the thick wooden door behind him. Uhura dragged over the bucket and rinsed off his head wound as best she could with her tied wrists. Then she awkwardly bandaged his head and sat back to wait. She tried to use her teeth on her bonds, but the knots were underneath and she couldn't get to them very well. After about an hour, Gerald groaned and opened his eyes. Uhura was at his side at once, inquiring about his head. I'm all right," he said, "for a man who's lost half his scalp." Uhura held up her bound wrists. "Do something." With his stiff, bloody fingers, Gerald untied her bonds after several tries. Then she untied his. "Not that this is going to do much good," she said, gesturing at the thick door. "Who are these ambushers?" "Oh, the Trasmene. They're revolutionists." Uhura looked at him a moment. "Does the kingdom of Thrace need a revolution? What are you doing or not doing that gets your citizens upset?" Gerald sat up and shrugged, wincing as he held his head. "There are always malcontents." "Uh-huh," Uhura said. "That's probably what they call George Washington and the Continental Congress, or the men who stormed the Bastille or the Winter Palace." "They're Turks, in a manner of speaking. They've intermarried with the original Thracians, and, well, there are some ancient hatreds which die very slowly." "Are we going to die very slowly, by the way?" she asked. Gerald nodded, still feeling his head. "Yes, I imagine so. I'm afraid I misjudged them. It was my regiment which defeated them in Byzantium 3 months ago. I wasn't even there, but—" he shrugged and winced. "So they will make my execution very public." He looked up at her, pain in his eyes. "Please forgive me. I got you into this, but I had no idea they had a cell here. There are not many, but they are good at the surgical strike. To remove a prince in the capital city, to make him an example—" He made a slight gesture. "It is what I'd do in their position." "And what will you do in your position?" He managed a weak smile. "Either one of two things. Either escape or try to manage a dignified death." "Would you mind working first on escaping?" she said. "They took my communicator, or we could just beam up to the Enterprise, and they don't expect me back for 2 days." "We'll be dead by then. They'll thumb their noses at the Federation, too, with your death. They're fanatics, terrorists." "Why don't you just give them some place to live?" "Because they will not take the offer. They're perhaps 4% of the population, but they want to govern. No one else wants them to govern, especially not those of Greek descent. It would be a bloodbath. We have tried to talk reason, but they break treaties, change their demands, kill our ambassadors. They think to terrorize us into slavery." He shrugged. "That, of course, will never happen. They are most unrealistic. Political amateurs with huge egos. We would try to live in peace with them, but—" He shrugged and winced in pain. He managed to smile, though it obviously hurt. "There is only one consolation in all this." "Great stars, what?" Uhura said in surprise. "To have my last sight be you." She stared at him a moment, and then her shoulders slumped. "Oh, great, beautiful. We're about to get sacrificed for some cause I never heard of, and you get romantic." Her eyes rolled toward the ceiling. He looked embarrassed. "But it is true," he protested. He reached for her, but she got up and moved away. Nyota! Uhura turned back to look at him. You know, maybe these people do have a point in what they're doing if the leaders here are all like you. Oh, you're charming. You're handsome. You're a prince. Me with a prince. You look and sound and act like all the handsome, dashing princes a girl ever reads about, except for one thing. And that is, he said a bit stiffly, that we're about to become sacrificial victims in some political struggle of which I know almost nothing. She leaned toward him. And what are you doing about it? He touched his head. Thinking of a way to escape? Uhura crossed her arms and looked at him. After a moment of embarrassed silence, he spread his hands. I can't think with you looking at me like that. She snorted as she turned away, impatiently looking around the small stone cell. We could overpower the guard, he suggested. With what? She asked. You have a bashed-in head, and they have weapons. We're not tied up anymore, he said. We could pretend to still be tied and jump them, that's it. Uhura made a face. I've seen this one before. I pretend to be sick. I moan and groan, and you shout for the guard, and he rushes in, and you sock him, and we grab his weapon and shoot our way out. He smiled. You pick things up quickly. Uhura gave a most unladylike snort. Oh, come on, grow up. Half the movies in history wouldn't have gotten past the second reel without dumb guards, but that's in fiction. Well, maybe they wouldn't be, guards if they were very smart to begin with. After all, advancement can't be very much. They associate with the lowest kind. Prisons definitely smell. He looked around. Can't do you much good aesthetically around places like this either. Those are prison guards, Prince. These are revolutionists. There must be a difference. Prince Gerald said thoughtfully. Can't think what it might be. Pays no good in these revolutionary armies, if you ever get paid at all. I suppose there's something in loot, possibly pillage too, or is pillage the process of obtaining loot? A certain amount of freedom of choice, I imagine, but then most prison guards have a lifetime job with a pension. He looked at Uhura. No, can't imagine what the difference might be. She gave him a long look. You really were hit on the head, weren't you? She went over and sat beside him on the cot. Look, Prince, Gerald, we've got to work together. It'll take everything we have to overcome all this. He smiled at her. Any suggestions? She sighed. Yes. Look, I hope you won't take this too badly, but, well, you were the one badly hurt. So it would be more natural if you were the one to try the dying trick. Oh, you really want to try my suggestion of luring the guards? She nodded. Oh, good. I thought it might be too unconventional. Uhura looked at him a moment. Macedon really is a long way out, isn't it? She sighed again. All right, look. You lie there looking close to death, but in a position to grab him if he comes close. Like this? He said, and stretched out dramatically. No, try this, she said, putting his feet together and straightening him on the cot. Do you think you could try to bleed a little? He blinked at her. I didn't think I'd stopped, the way it hurts and all. You know, Prince, you are one guy on the ballroom floor and a different one here. He smiled weakly. So are you, Lieutenant Commander Uhura. So soft and lovely on the terrace, such a chained tiger here. Uhura managed a smile. You know, I think you're right. Now get your act going. Groans. I want groans. He began to groan, and as he got more into it, he modified into a few moans as well. Uhura ran to the door and pounded on it. He's dying, you scabrous marsh cats. Help him. He's Prince Gerald. You can't just let him die. Not like this. Help. Listen, you. The door rattled open, and Uhura was looking into the muzzle of a weapon she did not recognize, but she recognized the steady hand and the impassive face. Back up, he growled. She backed up. His eyes slid across to Gerald. So he's sick. So what? Not sick. Dying, she said loudly. He's had a hemorrhage. He's going to die. Can't you see that? What good is it if he dies here, you idiot?" His impassive face and dead eyes swung around to look at Uhura. "What's it to you? Think you'd want to see our plans fail?" For a moment she had no answer, but then she thought something like the truth might help. "Because the longer he's alive, I'm alive, and as long as I'm alive, there's a chance to get out of this." Their captor made a rude sound, and his eyes crinkled in what could have been an unborn smile. "Not likely," he said. "What does he need, then?" "How do I know? I'm not a doctor. Look at him yourself. In your line of work, you must have seen a few bashes." He nodded and walked over, as lithe as a cat, his big strange weapon in his fist. Gerald let out a groan and started to thrash around a bit. "No," he groaned. "No, I don't want to die. No, Mother, Matriarch, no, oh." The thug bent over Jarl, but the gun was right in his stomach. "Let me see that, Princey. Ah, blazes, that's not bad. You aristocrats are all alike, thin-blooded." Jarl opened his eyes. Mother, you've come. I couldn't die without seeing you. Kiss me, Mother, kiss me." Jarl reached up and put his arms around the thug's neck and pulled him down. The thug's eyes bulged and he cried out, "Hey, what you doing, you—" The gun was away from Jarl's stomach, and Uhura leaped into the air and kicked with both feet against the side of the jailer's head. He fell with a clatter and lay still. Jarl rolled from the bed and grabbed the weapon. He groaned and staggered, but led the way toward the cell door. There were 2 more of the revolutionaries in the outer room, but neither of them moved fast enough. They were on the streets in moments. "It's Garrett Crafter Street," he said. "This way." "I'll relieve you, Liz," Uhura said to Elizabeth Palmer, who got up, stretched, and left the bridge. Captain Kirk swiveled his chair around and smiled at her. On the main screen, Macedon was dwindling fast. "Did you enjoy liberty?" he asked. She pursed her lips and thought a moment. "Yes, Captain. Macedon was very educational." Kirk's smile widened. "Who learned from whom, Commander?" "Why, Captain Kirk," she said, "you know the Federation policy, to render aid and assistance at every opportunity." "I thought as much," Kirk said, and swiveled toward the screen. "Warp 4, Mr. Sulu." "Aye, sir."